This morning, Sean Diddy Combs acquitted of the most serious charges he faced in federal criminal court: racketeering, conspiracy, and trafficking.
Today's a great victory. It's a great victory for Sean Combs.
But the music mogul will remain behind bars until his sentencing, after the judge denied bail, saying that the defense...
What just happened in a Manhattan courtroom left people stunned. Sean Diddy Combs, once one of the most powerful men in music, walked away cleared of the charges that could have sent him to prison for life. But at the same time, the jury hit him with convictions that still carry years behind bars. It wasn't the outcome anyone expected, not the prosecutors who spent years building their case, not the defense team who bet everything on silence, and not the fans who had followed his meteoric rise from Harlem hustler to billionaire mogul. So how did Diddy manage to beat the most explosive accusations, sex trafficking and racketeering, yet still find himself staring at a prison sentence that could end his career for good? The answer lies in what the jury heard inside that courtroom, and in what they didn't. When the jury walked back into the courtroom after 3 tense days of deliberation, every eye locked on them. Then came the words no one expected. Sean Diddy Combs was not guilty of racketeering conspiracy. He was not guilty of sex trafficking by force or coercion. Those were the charges that could have carried decades, even life, behind bars. But the jury didn't let him walk free. They found him guilty on 2 lesser counts: transporting people across state lines for illegal encounters, violations under the Mann Act, serious charges even if they didn't have the same weight as sex trafficking. Inside the courtroom, the split verdict landed like an explosion. Combs dropped to his knees, his hands pressed together in prayer. His family, who had been bracing for the worst, erupted in relief, clapping, hugging, cheering. His attorneys, who hadn't called a single witness in his defense, celebrated as if they'd pulled off the impossible. Mark Agnafilo, his lead lawyer, called it a great victory for Sean Combs and a win for the jury system. But beneath the celebration, the reality was far harsher. The Mann Act convictions alone carry up to 20 years combined, and prosecutors made it clear they weren't backing down. To them, this wasn't a victory for Diddy. It was proof that the jury believed at least part of their case. And outside the courthouse, the reaction was just as divided. Crowds of supporters swarmed, chanting "Free Puff," as if the trial had ended in triumph. At the same time, critics mocked him with bizarre stunts, even staging scenes that echoed the disturbing stories told during the trial. The split mirrored the verdict itself. A man partly cleared, but far from exonerated. If the jury's verdict gave Sean Combs and his team a reason to celebrate, Judge Aaron Subramanian wasted no time reminding them that this was no homecoming parade. The very same day, his attorneys pushed for bail, arguing that after nearly a year behind bars, Diddy deserved the chance to go home until sentencing. They offered a $1 million bond, home detention in Miami, even electronic monitoring. His lawyers described him as a model prisoner, someone quietly reflecting, someone with no reason to run. But the judge wasn't buying it. He cut through the defense's polished pitch with a blunt reality check. Subramanian cited Combs' own lawyers' words, their admission that, in his words, they own the domestic violence. The judge pointed to years of disturbing behavior laid out during trial and said plainly, Sean Combs wasn't just a man who had lost control once or twice. He was someone who had lived a pattern of violence over and over for decades. In the judge's eyes, that made him dangerous. Too dangerous to release, no matter how much money was offered, no matter how many restrictions were promised. Subramanian flatly denied bail, declaring that it would be impossible for Combs to prove he wasn't a threat to others. The ruling stunned Combs' family, who had moments earlier been celebrating the not guilty verdicts. For them, it meant more time watching him in a jail cell instead of by their side. For his defense team, it meant their so-called victory was instantly undercut by the reality that prison was still waiting. And with October 3rd set as the official sentencing date, the countdown had begun. Prosecutors weren't finished. In fact, they were preparing to double down, armed with evidence they claimed showed the world exactly who Sean Combs really was. For prosecutors, this trial was never just about what happened behind closed hotel doors. It was about showing a pattern. Years of control, manipulation, and abuse hidden behind the glossy image of a music mogul. To prove that, they brought in over 30 witnesses, each adding a piece to the puzzle. Some of the most powerful testimony came from women who said they had been pulled into Diddy's world, only to find themselves trapped in what prosecutors described as a cycle of fear and exploitation. They spoke about drugs being forced into their system, nights that blurred into chaos, and the overwhelming sense that leaving wasn't an option. Their words painted a chilling picture, one that stripped away the luxury and left only the violence. Prosecutors also leaned heavily on surveillance footage. The infamous 2016 hotel video showing Combs assaulting Cassie Ventura. That clip, played again and again in court, silenced the room each time. It was raw, undeniable evidence that could not be explained away. One witness even described it as the smoking gun moment of the trial, a glimpse into what happened when the cameras weren't rolling. But the case wasn't built only on victims' voices and video. The government also relied on insiders, employees, and associates who testified about what they had seen while working for Combs. Hotel staff described cleaning up after chaotic nights. Security members admitted they had been told to look the other way. Former business partners recounted conversations where Diddy allegedly bragged about his power and control. Piece by piece, the prosecution argued, the pattern became undeniable. To tie it all together, they didn't call Sean Combs a music icon, they called him the ringleader of a criminal enterprise, someone who used his wealth and influence not to inspire but to dominate. Their closing argument made it clear this wasn't about one bad night or even one bad relationship. This was about a man who built an entire lifestyle around control, intimidation, and excess, and left countless lives damaged in the process. For the jury, the question wasn't whether Combs was guilty of something, it was how much of it they could pin on him under the law, and that uncertainty set the stage for a verdict that shocked everyone. While prosecutors filled the courtroom with over 30 witnesses, the defense team chose a completely different approach: silence. They called no witnesses, presented no new evidence, and didn't even put Sean Combs on the stand. To most people, that would look like surrender, but to his lawyers, it was a calculated gamble. Their strategy wasn't to overwhelm the jury with counter testimony, it was to hammer away at one simple point: doubt. They reminded jurors again and again that the government's witnesses weren't saints. Many had histories of substance abuse. Some had cut deals for immunity. Others had filed lawsuits seeking money. The defense argued that these weren't victims telling the truth. They were opportunists chasing headlines and payouts. Instead of building their own case, they turned the spotlight back on the prosecutions. Every inconsistency in testimony, every memory that didn't line up, every motive that seemed questionable was highlighted. The goal wasn't to convince the jury that Diddy was innocent. It was to make them wonder if the prosecution had really proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And when the verdict came back, the strategy seemed to pay off. His lead attorney, Mark Agnifilo, called it a tremendous victory, saying that the jury rejected the government's attempt to destroy Sean Combs. For the defense team, walking away with only 2 convictions out of all the charges originally filed was proof that their minimalist approach had worked. But critics saw it differently. They argued the defense had won a partial victory, not because of skill, but because the jury hesitated to connect every piece of the prosecution's puzzle. To them, the silence in court wasn't strength. It was a shield that happened to hold, just barely. Either way, the defense walked out celebrating, while Combs' future still hung in the balance. Their strategy had bought him time, but not freedom. The harshest judgment was still waiting at sentencing. For all the noise around the verdict, one fact remains: Sean Combs isn't going anywhere. He will stay locked up until his sentencing on October 3rd, and what happens that day could define the rest of his life. The convictions under the Mann Act may not carry the same life sentences as trafficking charges, but they are no small matter. Each count can bring up to 10 years in federal prison. Together, that's 20 years on the table, and prosecutors have already signaled they'll push for the maximum, framing him as a man who abused power for decades and who deserves to face the full consequences. The defense, meanwhile, has promised to fight. They'll argue for leniency, pointing to the not guilty verdicts on the heavier charges, Combs' age, and the fact that he has already spent months behind bars. But federal judges don't take lightly to cases involving violence, especially ones backed by evidence as disturbing as the hotel footage. Even with skilled lawyers, Combs is facing an uphill climb. And beyond the prison time, sentencing brings other consequences: financial penalties, strict supervision if he ever gets out, and the permanent stain of a federal conviction. Even if he doesn't get the maximum term, the impact will echo far beyond the courtroom. For fans and critics alike, that October date looms like a countdown clock. Will the judge hand down a sentence that effectively ends Diddy's life in the spotlight, or will he walk away with a punishment lighter than many expect? Until that moment arrives, one thing is certain: the final chapter hasn't been written yet. For Sean Combs, the courtroom drama isn't ending with the criminal trial. In fact, some say the civil lawsuits could be even more devastating. Multiple women have stepped forward with accusations of abuse, intimidation, and long-term exploitation. These cases don't require a unanimous jury or the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. They hinge on credibility and evidence that tips the scales just enough. That means Combs could face massive financial penalties even if he manages to avoid more prison time. And the headlines surrounding these lawsuits sting just as much as the potential payouts. Every new filing drags his name back into the spotlight, tying him not to his music or business ventures, but to allegations that paint him as manipulative and dangerous. Each detail, whether proven or not, chips away at the public image he spent decades building. The fallout is already visible. Corporate partners that once lined up to attach their brands to the Diddy empire are stepping back. Endorsements have vanished. Business ventures have gone quiet. Even some of his closest industry allies, people who once toasted with him at the Grammys or partied at his legendary events, have gone silent. The loyalty that once seemed unshakable is now cracked by fear of association. For fans, the shift is even more dramatic. Millions grew up on his music, watched his rise from Harlem hustler to billionaire mogul, and admired his relentless drive. But now, many of those same fans can't separate the hits from the headlines. To them, the man who once preached about success and ambition looks like someone consumed by the very power he flaunted. And that's the part no sentence, no appeal, and no settlement can undo. Even if Combs finds a way to cut his prison time short or fight off the lawsuits, his reputation has already collapsed under the weight of everything revealed. In the world of hip-hop and business, second chances exist, but a complete return to power, that may be gone for good. In the end, Sean Combs walked out of his trial both cleared and condemned, acquitted of the charges that could have locked him away for life, yet still branded guilty of crimes that could strip years from his freedom. For some, it feels like justice dodged. For others, justice finally caught up. But no matter how the sentencing plays out in October, one thing is certain: the image of Diddy as an untouchable mogul is gone. The man who once embodied success, wealth, and influence is now remembered just as much for violence, lawsuits, and a spectacular downfall.